Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to and what is right to do. A vibrant afternoon to the guest speaker, respected principal sir, teachers, and our amicable attendees. I'm Manas Agarwal from Samvedna, the Gender Sensitization Forum of Sri Aurobindo College.
And I, Shreya Tyagi from Paki, the Women Empowerment Cell of Sri Aurobindo College, extend a warm and euphoric welcome to each one of you. We will take you through today's webinar. Let us start today's event by seeking the blessings from the Lord Almighty. The topic for today's webinar is gender discrimination and harassment. Know your rights. Before we begin, let us walk you through the genesis of both of our societies.
Samvedna, the Gender Sensitization Forum of Sri Aurobindo College, Delhi University, was established in November 2016. Edifies on the initiative taken by the UGC, the AVID Forum pivots on inculcating the zest for gender equality amongst all the students with the aid of activities and serene wisdom.
Paki was established to create social awareness about the problems of women, to develop self-confidence in women, and to make them aware of the laws meant to protect them. It has been working for 4 years to achieve its goals. We have organized multiple events to uplift, create awareness, and empower women.
The link for the feedback form will be shared after the question and answer session. Everyone who has joined and has questions for the expert may kindly type in the question and answer box. We will try to take as many questions as possible.
Now, I would like to request all the panelists to turn their front camera so that we can take a snapshot.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We will make sure that you get something out of this session.
There is a famous dictum, no one can make a needle float, but a team can make a ship float. This has been the modus operandi that has brought us where we are today.
Today, we have with us Dr. Vinita Chandra. She has done her bachelor's, master's, and MPhil in English literature from Delhi University. She has done her master's in English literature and PhD from Rutgers University, USA, and PhD. Her doctoral thesis is titled Constructing National Identities and Anglo-Indian Friction. She's an associate professor in Ramjas College, Delhi University. She has been teaching English literature there from 1986 to present. Dr. Vinita has been involved with issues of gender and sexual harassment for the last 2 decades. She's one of the founding members of the Gender Sensitization Committee of Ramjas College.
She has been the chairperson of Sexual Harassment Complaint Committee several times since it was made mandatory by law. She conducts workshops, orientations, lectures, and discussion on sexual harassment routinely. She has published and given interviews about sexual harassment extensively over the last few years. She has contributed a chapter to the Routledge Handbook of the Politics of the Me Too movement, which came out in 2021. She teaches a module in the United Nations University Gender Equality Scholarship and Training in Reykjavik, Iceland, on gender security and violence. As we all know, the key to growth is the introduction of the higher dimension of consciousness into our awareness. So let's begin. Over to you, Dr. Vinita.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I hope I can do justice to all those things. It is something I've been thinking about for many years. But let me tell you that more than the academic work I do on it or what I teach on it, it is my experience of being in sessions like this one where I am just now and speaking to students like you all who are here for awareness, who are here to make this world a better place. And so this is what is the most important thing for me, actually, having an interactive session. And I hope that we can actually have a conversation. I was told that I should try to speak perhaps for half an hour or so. I'd rather not speak that much because I know that you all have some wonderful questions. I've had a very quick look at some of them. But maybe I'm not sure if everyone who's here was here when I did the talk last time. And maybe there are some new people as well. I'm hoping that many of the old people who were there have come back because there were questions in that session. In the last session, I had talked about sexual harassment. I had talked about what women go through, not just what women go through in their workplace, but what women go through every day in their lives because we live in a patriarchy. And those were questions that we had talked about, issues that we had talked about last time, that sexual harassment doesn't come out of nowhere. Discrimination doesn't come out of the vacuum. It comes out of a structural and systemic patriarchy that teaches us things that we do on a day-to-day basis and makes it seem like it is natural. That's the normal way to behave. And anything that we do out of the natural or the normal is going to invite punishment. These are things I had talked about last time. And I don't know if it is okay that if I can just take the conversation forward, just let me know if I should repeat any of what I said last time or if we can just move ahead a little bit. What do you all think?
Ma'am, we can surely move ahead.
Okay.
With the questions and answers. I would now like to invite Ganishthata and Rudrani to take the session forward and ask ma'am questions that we have.
Okay, I'm just going to say a few things before we start. What I had meant is that should I repeat what I did last time, or should I just say what I have to say for this session? So I'm going to take just maybe five.
Yes, ma'am. Please.
Say what I want so that we can have a sort of a structure in what we want to talk about. We did talk about patriarchy last time and what it does to women. What I wanted to talk about this time a little bit, of course, the questions can come from anywhere. It's also what patriarchy does to men. That is that we always see women at the center of sexual harassment, right? That's what we talk about. But there would not be sexual harassment without men. Now, remember, I had said this last time also, that when we talk about sexual harassment of women, I think we should all recognize that sexual harassment does also happen to men. It certainly happens to non-binary people. It happens to transgenders. It happens to sexual minorities. It happens to non-cisgender people in general. It also happens to boys and men who don't adhere to society's conventions of looking manly, right? So men who we think are not manly enough looking are also harassed. So I just want to say that even though I'm going to say women, I actually mean all of these categories. But the harassers in general are cisgendered men. And so what does patriarchy do to men to make them harassers? Why is it that some men become harassers? Because we know that all men are certainly not harassers. And a few of the things I wanted to look at is where toxic masculinity comes from. And I must say that this is thanks to your generation that we have this wonderful term, toxic masculinity. We had never even thought masculinity was supposed to be such a good thing that we couldn't even imagine adding the word toxic before it. And now we know that if something is toxic, if it's poisonous, it's not just going to spread the poison outside, it's also going to spread the poison within. And we see that happening in so many, health issues. With men, we are talking about not just physical health issues of heart attacks and so on, but also looking at mental health issues of so many men who are trying to detoxify themselves in some ways or are suffering because of that, are not able to have proper relationships with other people because of the way that they have been brought up to be toxic masculine. So one of the things I want us to think about is, where does this toxic masculinity come from? And why do men feel the need to have power and control over women? So some of the questions I want us to think about is that why is it that that society, and remember, it is not just men who do this. We know that, we know the Saas Bahu story very well. We know that it is mothers-in-law, it is sisters-in-law, mothers even, who try to keep daughters-in-law in place. And of course, what they are doing is that they are internalizing patriarchy, and they're exerting the control over women that men want women to have over them. So this idea of, women being kept in their place, how they say, apni jagah samjho, you should know your place. So what is this place? I just want us to think a little bit about what this place is. And we are looking at a society, we are looking at women's place in a society that is patriarchal and that is also heteronormative. So remember that heterosexuality is the norm. And so a woman who is kept in her place in a patriarchal heteronormativity is a woman who must get married at a pretty much young age, because, as they will say, that if a girl is old, then she is not able to adjust. So what does this adjustment mean? Adjust means that she is not able to, she doesn't speak for herself. She does whatever she's asked to do by other people. A woman who doesn't want to have children is considered to be just an misfit in society. So this idea of patriarchal heteronormativity, why is it that women and non-binary people, transgender, sexual minorities, why is it that they're keeping their place in a patriarchy is important? Because if you think about it, patriarchy is so strong. Why does it not have the confidence in itself that it can allow some dissent, it can allow some resistance? Why is that confidence not there in patriarchy at all, that women are constantly being suppressed? And one of the things I want us to think about is that, why is it so scary and threatening to consider women as equals? Why does that bring fear in so many people in society, that women might be considered as equals? And I'm not just talking about, in a wonderful place like you all have here, where clearly men and women are equal. I'm not talking about spaces like this, but I'm talking even about Delhi University as a whole, colleges as a whole, our families, society outside, that to think, Simone de Beauvoir says this, imagine a world that is equal, in which 50% of the women on the road, drivers on the road, are women. I mean, I'm just saying these things in a situation in India. 50% of your police officers are women, 50% of your bus drivers are women. I'll say to all the women here, supposing you came out of the metro station and 50% of your rickshawalas were women. Can you imagine that? And I'm saying this because Delhi University in the last, just before the pandemic, had one woman auto driver. And our students were so happy just to see her, because you just felt safe sitting in that auto. But can you imagine that if you went to court, half the lawyers were women, half the judges were women. If you went to parliament, half the parliamentarians were women. Can you even imagine that kind of life and how it would make us feel? And why is it that is so dangerous? What is the fear of women, as it were? And I'm just going to say this very quickly. We don't have to talk about this very much at all, but every single religion, and this is stuff that I have from research that other people have done, I don't have very much research of my own in this, every single religion has actually very specific texts on how women must be kept in their place. Because if women are not kept in their place, the power that they have will overwhelm the universe. And I know that from our own tradition, we have Kali Ma. When she was given the power of destruction, she could not contain it. She had to be destroyed because she could not contain that power. And this kind of figure is available almost everywhere. The woman who has too much power, so-called, is always going to misuse it. So I just want us to think about what this fear of women then does to men. Because if you are growing up being told that women have to be protected, they have to be kept down, they have to wear proper clothes all the time, they should not talk too much, then what does it do? How does it bring up men who then, as they grow up and they go out in society, when they see a woman who's walking freely on the street, or who's talking, or who's in any way going against these rules and norms, how do we blame that young man for what he does to women? Now, please don't misunderstand me. I am not at all justifying sexual harassment, sexual assault, not at all. But I am saying that simply putting in rules to punish these people is not going to get us anywhere. We have to be able to understand where it is coming from and where the men who are doing the sexual harassment are coming from. Because very often, much of the work that I do is actually to sit with these men. Whenever I get a case of sexual harassment, one of the things I do, or gender discrimination, is that I sit and talk to the men. And I have seen, I think in almost every case, I have seen that there is surprise. There is actually surprise that there is a different world out there, that you have to think about women in different ways. And so the important thing really is to understand and to try to change these things, not simply to put people behind bars or to expel them from college or to suspend them. Those things are never going to change things very much at all. Now, along with this, there's just one more thing I'm going to highlight for you all. And then, of course, we will go into the question answers, because I know you have a lot of questions. One of the things that the fear of women as equals has done is that it has asked women to remain silent. Because if women speak up, they are going to speak up for what is wrong. And I know I talked about this last time, but I want you to think about our own mythology. I want you to think about Draupadi. And I know that all of you must be familiar with the Chirharan scene. And I just want to remind you, in our Indian classical literature paper, those of you who are in English literature students will know this, Draupadi makes a very passionate and powerful speech. And her speech is not at all saying, I'm a poor, helpless woman, please leave me alone. Not at all. She knows all the laws. She quotes the laws. She knows all the statecraft, and she quotes all that. She knows her rights. And she says, none of you have the right to do this to me. So the first speech that we have of power, that comes from Draupadi. And Draupadi somehow is only seen as this woman who is then saved by Krishna later on, and she vows revenge. That is what we see her as the person who caused the war, as it were. But that speech of hers is an act of resistance, as it were. And I know that I don't know how many people are familiar with Valmiki's Ramayana, because the Ramayana we are used to is the Tulsidas Ramayana, which ends with Ram and Sita coming back from Lanka. But Valmiki's Ramayana actually ends with Ram coming to the ashram, to Valmiki's ashram, and asking Sita to come back with him. And when she agrees to come back with him, he says, you will have to go through a second Agni Pariksha. And there's recently a very good scholarly work that has come out that's analyzed that speech of Sita's when she refuses to go back. And in essence, she says, remember, he's the Lord, he's the God, and she accepts him as God. She knows he is God. And yet she says to him, I'm going back to my own home. I am not going to go through the humiliation of another ordeal, of another Agni Pariksha. I'm not going to keep proving my chastity again and again. And she asks the earth to open up, and she goes in, because that is her home. That's her mother, right? The earth is her mother. And she goes back into the home. So I just want us to remember that this is not a new thing. If women are speaking up, it's not a new thing. And the fear of women speaking up is not a new thing at all. So if you were just to think a little bit, if Draupadi had not spoken up, if she had quietly allowed herself to be disrobed, and she had not prayed that she is not disrobed, what would have happened? There would have been no Mahabharata at all. There would have been the humiliation of a woman, and that would have been the end of that. So I just to think a little bit, and this is just to give you one classic example, that why is women's speech so feared that women are made to be silent about everything all the time. And women's silence includes everything. Women are not supposed to speak about their menstruation. Women are not supposed to speak about their pregnancy. I know for all of the faculty members who are here, if you live in India and you have been pregnant, God forbid that you can show that stomach in public. Everyone knows that there's a child over there, but you cannot show it to anyone because that is too shameful. So all the things that women are meant to be silent about, including sexual assault. If a woman is raped or she's assaulted, it is her shame, and she should never mention it to anyone because the shame is hers, as considered by society, that she's a woman who's been defiled. She's a spoiled woman now, so she should not speak about it. And the last thing I want to say along with this is that because women are always meant to suffer silently, they are never meant to speak about their suffering or their sacrifice or their trauma. That is why words like feminism are seen as bad words. Now, I know that in this, in your society, that is that Pakhi and Samvedna, I know that you people have a much higher level of awareness. The reason that you are holding these sessions is because you believe in feminism. You're all feminists because you believe that women should have equal opportunities as men. So I know that you won't have this question, but almost every time I talk about this, somebody or the other asks me, why do we have to label ourselves as feminists? So even calling yourself feminist is as if feminism is a bad word, as if women ask for equality, only equality. Women are not asking for anything more than equality. And I can guarantee you that that equality is not going to come in my life or in your life. At all, because the inequality is so huge. But feminism is considered such a bad word that women don't want to be called feminists. In a session I had a few days ago with my debating society members, one of the women asked me this. She said that the minute you say that because I'm a woman, I'm feeling this way, she says people turn around and say, oh, you're playing the woman's card to get sympathy. What other card do we have? We are women. We only have the women's card. We don't have the man's card. And yet, as women, we are expected to use the man's card. How can we do that? But just to see the ways in which even today, society tries to keep women silent by making them ashamed to call themselves feminist, by making them ashamed to talk about what happens to them because they're using the woman's card. They're trying to get empathy without looking, for instance, at things like, in the 25 minutes that I have been speaking, we know that worldwide 25 women have got raped. But for some reason, those are not the things we need to talk about. We need to talk about how feminism is a bad thing. So these were the few things I just wanted to say, as a winding up of what we talked about last time. And just to say that, as we have the questions and all, of course, we'll discuss these things, but just the importance of speaking. And that is why, instead of thanking you all for calling me right in the beginning, I thought I wanted to say this. And just to thank you all for organizing things like this, in which women's voices and things that concern women are heard and are talked about, because otherwise these things are shrouded in a silence that is almost unbreakable. So Shreya, absolutely, yes, go ahead and take questions. There can be questions about anything. They don't have to be about things that I have talked about.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for providing us with all this vital information. I would now like to invite Ganashtata and Rudrani to take the session forward by asking Dr. Vinita the questions that we have received. Over to you, Ganashtata and Rudrani.
Thank you, Shreya. So let us begin with the Q&A session. There are few questions in the chat box. We will take as many as possible. So first question is for you, ma'am. What happens if there is a no witness to claim a sexual harassment?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and it's a question that comes up very often. Now, the nature of sexual harassment is that it usually happens in private. it actually doesn't usually happen in a public place. Because the men or whoever is doing the sexual harassment knows that this is wrong, and that their word is going to be believed over the woman's word always. So remember that we have an amendment to the law now. That is, for us in India itself, the 2013 Parliamentary Act, which is the amendment to the earlier rape law, has added a whole a section on sexual harassment of women in the workplace. And one of the things that this does is it looks at evidence not in the way that you look at evidence in a criminal case. So it doesn't have to be proved beyond doubt. It has to be plausible in general. So there are a few things to think about, and I'm just going to say these few things very quickly. I don't know if this is going to be useful or not, but I know that you all must be having your own ICC as well, Internal Complaints Committee. And I have not only served on the, first there used to be a college complaints committee, and then from 2016, I think it has become an internal complaints committee. But I have also, one of the areas in which I'm doing a lot of work now is this thing about institutional, how does an institution respond to sexual harassment? And just a few tips that I would say. One is that the first time a victim of sexual harassment talks to somebody, that has to be recorded properly, because that is the time when the trauma that the victim has gone to is going to come out. And I have also been called as a witness in several cases, because it has happened in many cases that the first person who someone has talked to about sexual harassment is me. And you know, the sexual harassment does not have to be sexual assault. It just has to be demeaning and humiliating somebody little by little. And usually there is not enough evidence of it. So how do you go through that case? You go through it by talking to that person. You go through it by recognizing that there is a patriarchal structure in which women are treated in a particular way just because they are women. I had a case recently in my own college in one of the societies where all the office bearers are women. And they were harassed by these two men. And the two men kept saying, we would have behaved like this, whether they were men or women or not. Just a basic lack of understanding of patriarchy, that nobody treats men and women exactly the same way. Even we don't. We women who are doing this work, we also talk to women differently from the way we talk to men. If our principal is a man, we will talk to him differently. If our principal is a woman, we will talk differently. This is a fact. And all of us know this in whatever positions we are. So remember, I'm talking about a sensitization of all of you as people who might receive complaints, that the complaints themselves have to be seen in a larger, in the broader view of patriarchy, that they are not going to have evidence. They're not going to have incontrovertible evidence. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you all know this, but the law in 2013, thank God, changed this terrible thing, which was there earlier for the rape law. And I know that my older colleagues will remember this. It was called the two-finger test. A raped woman had to go through the two-finger test to see if she was habituated to sex or not. Thank goodness that has been taken out of the law now. But there usually is very little evidence. So how do we work on that? And one of the things I would say to people who have been harassed is that you have to remember that nobody can gaslight your experience. Do not allow yourself to be gaslighted and told that this is not harassment, that it was your fault. It's just to understand how harassment works. I know there's lots of questions, so I'm going to try to keep my answers shorter. And then if there's a question alongside with it, then I can explain a little bit more if we need.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your thoughts on this. It was definitely an instructive one and will be of the utmost importance for all our attendees.
Firstly, thank you so much, ma'am, for your insightful talk that you just shared with us. I have our next question with me here, which says, can sexual harassment happen only with girls, or it happens with boys as well? Would the police react in the same way as in the case of girls?
This is actually a very, very good question, because I think we only look at women as being sexually harassed. The fact is that sexual harassment also happens with boys. And the really unfortunate thing about the 2013 Parliamentary Act is that it is not gender neutral. And the earlier Ordinance 15D, which my colleagues will remember, was absolutely gender neutral. It accepted that men and women were sexually harassed, whether they were teachers or they were students. But the new law does not have this thing for men at all. Let me just share with you all that the big case that came to Ramjas College after Ordinance 15D came in place was a case in which a very powerful male teacher had been sexually harassing and assaulting boys for years. And that case came to us, it sort of broke out suddenly. It was a very volatile moment in which all the students of the college got together, and then they finally gathered in the auditorium, and it was a very volatile situation. And I remember coming out, I had taught some of these boys, and I felt so morally undermined that I was a teacher in this college where this had been happening for so many years. And I said, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you come and tell us this was happening? And the one thing that they said, which I always remember and I repeat in every session I come to, is that they said, we never thought that sexual harassment happens to men. So remember that sexual harassment happens to boys, it happens to men, and it happens a lot more than we know. And again, just to share with you, I've been doing gender sensitization sessions for years, and just one session from this year, first year student asked to speak to me after the session, and he told me how he had been sexually assaulted in a wedding when he was 10 years old. It was by his own uncle, and he had never spoken about it to anybody. He told his mother, who said, don't mention it to anyone, just forget it. And even as he was talking to me 8 years later, he was crying. And so I asked him, I said, why didn't you even speak to your friends before this? Now, one of the things that I just want to say to you all is that in many ways, it is easier for women to speak about sexual harassment than it is for men, because women expect it. Women expect to be sexually assaulted or harassed every single day of their lives. Men don't expect it. And when men are sexually harassed or assaulted, there is so much shame that they feel, because it also attacks their masculinity. So I really want to say to all the men, and I want to say to all of you, is that this false sense of masculinity should never make you feel ashamed if you have been harassed by somebody else or assaulted. Remember that it is that toxic masculinity of that other person. So this is one part of it, that is that yes, it does happen. The other is that it is reported much less, because men are so embarrassed and ashamed of saying that they have been sexually harassed. The other question, would the police take it the same way? I think that very few sexual harassment cases of men go to the police at all, unless it is outright rape, and that rape has also been caught red-handed. I think very few cases go to the police. We know that the police don't really take seriously women who come and say, I have been sexually harassed or attacked. I have had cases of women who have come to me saying, I have been date raped, and then I say, okay, do you want to go to the police? I'll come with you. And in general, they don't want to go to the police. I think that most men simply don't go to the police at all, because then it makes this whole matter so much public. Whether the police would react better to boys than to girls, I really don't know. I think there's just not enough data on that, because police just don't get enough cases from boys.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an edifying answer. I'm sure your critical insights will definitely shape the ideology of all our attendees here.
So, ma'am, we have a next question for you. Are compliments about girls' appearance considered to be sexual harassment?
That's a very interesting question. If you look at the law, one of the things that it says is it really emphasizes the word again and again is unwelcome. Anything which is unwelcome is sexual harassment. So as I say, you can come to college and you can hug each other, and that's absolutely okay. But somebody who you don't want, if they even put a hand on your shoulder, that is sexual harassment. So one of the things about giving compliments is that, is it mutual? Is it welcome? I just want to say one very quick thing with this, because many men say, how do we know? How are we expected to know? We are not, we can't second guess women all the time. I think actually most men do have an instinct about it, because if you really want to be friends with somebody, you will make sure that you don't make them uncomfortable. So what kind of compliments are we giving? What are we complimenting women about? Everyone likes to be complimented on their physical looks, men as well as women. But how is that compliment being given? Is it a compliment that is even by someone who's well-meaning? Is it a demeaning compliment? If you're a woman and you're part of Paki or Samvedna, or you're a professor or associate professor, and you're constantly being told you're pretty, that certainly is fixing your identity to only one thing. So I think one of the things for us also to think about is what is it that we are complimenting in women all the time? Because we know that women are valorized only for their looks. Women are really not valorized very much for their brains. So perhaps it's time for us to start rethinking some of these things about how we compliment women. But the answer to that question really is that I don't think that men should stop complimenting women, or women should stop complimenting men, or even each other. In general, why do women never feel uncomfortable when other women compliment them? And some of my male colleagues who are part of the gender forum always say that, they say it's really interesting to us how when women meet each other, they'll touch the earrings, they'll say, oh, what lovely earrings, your hair is looking so nice, they'll touch the sari, what material is your sari? They say, how come you keep touching each other all the time and saying these things? I want to just ask most women, do we ever feel uncomfortable about it? Because there is no threat to that at all. Because we know that what is being appreciated is that earring. Where did you buy it from? I also want an earring like that. It's not to say, let me find an excuse to touch your earlobe. If someone is touching your sari ka kapda, it literally is, ki, let me see how good this kapda is. It's not like, let me touch your sari and then quickly touch your waist. We know that we are not threatened by that at all, right? So partly, I think it is also the fact that women are always on their guard. And they're always saying, okay, this is a compliment. Is it going to lead to something else? We are always in this panic that what is it going to lead to? And so I think, a compliment can certainly be just a compliment, but I think it's also important to understand why women are uncomfortable with compliments very often.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering it so well.
Moving ahead with the next question, we have the next question which reads as, according to you, what kind of sexual harassment are being faced by children in school?
Yeah, this is a question that I think people are just not addressing enough. And I think for those of you who are just out of school, and if you've been to co-ed schools or even just boys' schools or even girls' schools, I know that there's a lot of sexual assault that happens in boys' schools. Especially boys' boarding schools. And this is something that is well documented. It is something men talk about all the time. So we are not talking just about women or men, because remember that this is the age when children are just finding out about sex and sexuality. And one of the things that I think is changing now is that sex education in some schools is starting earlier. I have two children, they both went to Sri Ram school, and when my son was in school, they had the sex education class in class 6. But 4 years later, by the time my daughter came into school, they had it in class 5. And so I think one of the things, that you'll find people saying that sex education encourages children to explore sex. We know that that's not true at all. It actually gives them enough knowledge about things that are not talked about. So even very small children know that these things are being whispered about, what is actually being talked about. I still remember, to my great shame, that my son, I didn't know he'd had the sex education class. He didn't tell me about it, but he looked at the newspaper one morning and he said, what is gang rape? And I thought, he's so small, how am I going to explain to him what gang rape is? So I just said, it's when a bunch of men get together and beat up a woman. And many years later, he told me that he just thought that I just didn't know what gang rape is. And I just feel so ridiculous now that I should have been able to openly talk about something like this with him. So the exploration of sexuality is bound to begin in school. And children in school have still not had time to think about all those heteronormative patriarchal ideas that are in their heads. And I'm not even going to say that because nowadays movies are more explicit or social media is there, so things are increasing. That is not true. These things are being talked about more now. but it's not as if they're increasing now. So I still remember I had a friend who was a gynecologist in the mid 1980s. And she used to tell me how many schoolgirls used to come for abortion at that time. So we are certainly not talking about something that is new at all. One of the things that we know now, that sex without consent is rape. We know that. There's nothing like non-consensual sex. There's a word for it, and that is rape. And so a lot of what happens in school is at a time when girls simply don't have the knowledge to consent or not to consent. And the sexual assault, I'm not even just talking about sexual harassment, which is huge. I don't think there's anyone here who will not remember either being part of harassing or being harassed themselves for the way they looked or for the friends they had. Even if you, as a young kid, spoke to a girl or spoke to a boy, spoke to someone from the opposite sex, you got teased. Oh, why are you doing that? You always got teased, oh, so-and-so is your boyfriend or so-and-so is your girlfriend. And all of this amounts to a kind of a harassment that really, in a way, I think, traumatizes a child's psyche. And so to speak about this to children at a very young age is crucial. The other part of this, which is not included in the question actually, is about sexual assault of children. And apart from just school, what gender sensitization sessions over the last 20 years have taught me is that there is such a huge amount of sexual assault of children within the home. And I am not talking about children who don't have space to go and are assaulted by strangers. I'm talking about uncles and aunts and cousins and neighbors and tutors. It is appalling how many stories I hear every single time by people who have been assaulted, sexually molested at home, and also that they have never spoken to anyone about it. In general, when they talk about it, they will say they have never ever told anyone. So these are some things that we really need to think about. And most of them, when they talk about it, they say that we were so small, we didn't even know what was happening to us. We only realized much later exactly what had happened to us. And of course, there's no question of speaking about it if it's within the family. But I think these are things for all of you who are working on these issues and hopefully will go out into the world as policymakers and educators and people who are working on these issues. These are crucial things for us to remember.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your insights on such an undermined aspect. I'm sure all our attendees will keep in this mind that once we are out of this fear, we can do and affect a few more people out there.
It was great listening to you, ma'am. So moving forward to the next question. Does the orthodox culture lead to sexual harassment?
Yeah, it's a kind of a tricky question, because so often we think that if we're orthodox, then and we don't allow boys and girls to mix very easily, then sexual harassment can be stopped, isn't it? That the more conservative we are, the more boys keep to themselves and girls keep themselves covered and don't really talk to each other, themselves into the notice of anyone, sexual harassment will be less. Unfortunately, it's just not true at all. So does the orthodox culture lead to greater sexual harassment? My answer to that is yes. And the reason that it is yes is because orthodox cultures don't allow their young people to talk about sex and sexuality. And because they don't allow a conversation around these things, there is no way for the young men to think that the ideas that they have been brought up with, that women are property, that women are objects, that it is okay to whistle at them, it is okay to do something to them, when they have not met enough girls as classmates, as people who have the same marks as them, same intelligence as them, as people like I see you people so wonderfully working with each other. When they have not met women as equals, they can only ever treat women as unequal. It's not even to blame anyone. They don't know any other way. They are brought up in an orthodox home in which most likely their mother does not work. in which most likely the women do all the housework, in which most likely the men order the women around. And remember that when men have that much power over their women, that power is exerted in many ways, by shouting, by humiliating, by demeaning, by simply not seeing that person as a human being. So orthodoxy, although it says orthodox cultures say that we respect women, right? We put women on a pedestal. But that respect is only of a particular kind of woman. Only if a woman behaves like a Devi, she will be treated like a Devi. But a woman is not a Devi. A woman is a human being, and she's going to behave like a human being. And the minute she does that, then it seems like she's open game to insult, to assault, to mistreat, to do anything at all to. So, the term orthodox, which orthodoxy, like a conservative, the word conservative comes from conserving, right? People who are conservative believe in conserving what is in the past. They believe that things should not change. And so orthodoxy and conservative don't believe in change. They believe in keeping what has always been there. But the world around us is changing. Nobody is going to say anymore that women should not go to school, or women should not go to college, or women should not work. Our constitution guarantees us the right to vote, the right to education, the right against discrimination. So how is orthodoxy and our constitution going to go together? They can't actually go together. And so the reason that we need to think about changing orthodoxy, speaking up against orthodoxy, is not to tear down everything at all. We're not looking at tearing down society, not at all. But we are looking at finding a place for the new woman in this place, the woman who is also earning for the household, the woman who is also, going out in the public spaces. So I would say that unlike what seems to be the dominant ideas, that if women don't wear jeans that are torn, if women don't have cell phones, if women don't talk to boys, then there will be no sexual harassment. That actually works against it. And sexual harassment happens much more where there is orthodoxy than where there is not.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an informative answer. I hope attendee must got his or her answer.
Moving on to the next question, ma'am. We have a question which says, can sexual harassment be perpetrated by someone of the same sex?
Yeah. So we do know that that boys are sexually harassed by other boys, by men. So we know that that certainly exists. Are girls sexually harassed by girls? Now, that's a question I want us to just consider, because it's not something that's asked very often. When it comes to men, we know that the same patriarchy that makes men sexually harass women is what is going to make them sexually harass other men as well. And we know that there's a lot of sexual harassment among men. This is something that is well documented and known. There's a lot of work, interestingly, being done in the lesbian sector that is talking about sexual harassment of women by women. But it is still a very new area, and I really don't know enough about that, about power dynamics within women. But there is something I want to say. Sexual harassment, in the way that we understand it today, exists within a patriarchy. And that patriarchy gives all the power to men. So if it is a mother-in-law who is burning up her daughter-in-law or beating her daughter-in-law or something, that is the patriarchal power of the father-in-law that is being taken. It is not her own power. The mother-in-law has no power on her own. So how will she get power? She can only get power if she takes it from the men. Any woman who wants power in a patriarchal structure can only borrow it from the men, which is why women who are in power are women who exert patriarchal power. They will not use that power to control boys or other men or their husband. The mother-in-law will never use that power to control her own son or her husband. It will only be against the other women, right? So that we know. But sexual harassment of a sexual nature, not patriarchal nature, of women on women, I think the reason it is a little difficult to talk about is because it is outside patriarchy. So I know that when we talk about lesbian relationships, we always say that, but even in that relationship, one is more powerful than the other. And we know that in that relationship, some women are what is called butch, that is that they are more masculine, the other one is more feminine. But that doesn't happen based on your gender. It doesn't happen based on your sex. It happens based on a relationship. So if you were just to turn it around to say heterosexual marriages and just think that in every marriage, certainly some people's personality is more powerful or more aggressive than others. It could be the man or it could be the woman, right? But how is it that in most married relationships, it is the man who has the power? That's what patriarchy does. Your marriage is based on your gender roles, and everything about the marriage, if you don't just sign a piece of paper, but you have any kind of wedding ceremony, that power that the man has is established in that wedding ceremony. As we go ahead, the fact that the woman might need to change her name or any of those things, change her house, all of that, leave her job if her husband is posted somewhere else, all of that is based on patriarchy, which gives all the power to the man, even if his personality is not the more powerful or aggressive one from the woman. But what happens in a relationship between two women? That's a little difficult to say. There's still a lot of work being done. It's very new work. Remember that work on patriarchy and feminism goes back to at least 50 years, the scholarship work, if not more than that. Virginia Woolf is writing in the 1920s, that's 100 years ago. But work on lesbian relationships is very new. It started only in the last 10 years or so. So maybe, 10 years later or 5 years later, we might have a more lucid answer for that question. But you people are asking questions that are way ahead of your times already.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your valuable thoughts on this. I'm sure all of us present here will spare some time to actually scrutinize the question with a greater perspective.
So moving forward to the next question from one of our attendees. Do you agree with the notion that a victim blaming exacerbates sexual assault while denying accountability of the perpetrators?
Yeah, this is absolutely true. It's such a good question, and I'm so impressed that someone who's still in college is asking this question. One of the things that I have talked about in the chapter that I have on the Me Too movement, the Rutledge Handbook, is exactly this. Victim blaming is so prevalent that it is astounding. In principle, all of us agree that women should not be sexually harassed. We agree that women should not be sexually assaulted. But when a person comes, a real woman comes and says, I have been sexually harassed, and she appears before people to say, this is what happened to me, in 99% of cases, everyone will look at what she's wearing. Are her clothes too loud? Are her clothes too understated? Is she laughing too much? Is she not laughing at all? Is she talking too loudly? Is she not talking loudly enough? Why is she wearing lipstick? Why is she not wearing lipstick? Why did she come in and sit down? Why did she not? Every single thing. There is not one woman who will make a complaint who will not be scrutinized in detail to say, look at her, she asked for it. Look at her, she's the kind of woman. And this Me Too movement, everybody said that, yes, women should come up and they should say what has happened to them. But when the men who were named in the Me Too movement turned out to be our friends, our colleagues, our relatives, everyone got up and said, no, the woman is lying. It can't be true. This is the backlash that the Me Too movement saw happening to it. The other thing, just very quickly to say about the Me Too movement, is that the reason that it was so successful is because you couldn't see the woman's face. You couldn't hear her voice. All that you could see was a text message, a written down message, a digital message. And that digital message, you could not make out from that if the woman's voice is like mine. My voice is always prone to be squeaky. I wish I had that deep, husky voice. I always envy women with that deep, husky voice. You can't hear my voice. You can't see my face. You can't make out how I'm dressed. You cannot judge me at all by the fact that I'm a woman. So the reason that it was successful is because it's dehumanized, it depersonalized the woman. It took the materiality of the woman's body out of that complaint. Victim blaming happens in every single case, so that now rape laws across the world are trying to put laws in place to say you cannot question the woman. And you know, the last time I was here, we talked about the Tarun Tejpal case and the court order which has come out, which all that it does is victim blame. It's such a bad court order that the state of Goa has taken up against that order to say that it has to be removed. So one of the things that we know and that patriarchy has put into place for us is that actually women want to be assaulted. Somehow it is seen as if women always want it. And they are the ones who entice the men. They are the ones who lead the men on. And then poor man, when he says something or does something, then suddenly they start complaining about it. And this is so deeply in the mindset of society. If you do even the littlest bit of research, and I'm going to ask you, talk to male relatives. Go home and talk to them. A woman has to look in the direction of a man and they are convinced that she's making a pass at the man. It goes across the board, of the way that men and women are raised. So what victim blaming has done is it has made women believe that they are responsible for what happens to them. And I know that there are so many women I'll speak to who will say, I know this happened to me, but do you think I was wrong? Because when he said, let's go and have a drink, I should have said no. When he put his arm on my shoulder, I should have shrugged it off right away. Was it the clothes I was wearing? Was it because I was too friendly? So the two things that it has done, one is that it has undermined women's confidence entirely. Women actually gaslight themselves immediately to say, this was all my fault that it happened. And the second thing is that it has given men such a huge entitlement because men are brought up to believe that all women are always going to desire them. And it is so difficult for them. If you look at our acid attacks, if you look at our stalkings, if you look at women who are killed because they refused to marry somebody or refuse their advances, there's such a huge entitlement that because I like this woman, she has to like me. It seems to be that there is no understanding at all that you might like a woman and she might not like you at all. So at the heart of our struggle to have women's sexual harassment understood is victim blaming. And this is just a very, very good question and a very good, a thought. And the way the question is framed, I'm very impressed. Does victim blaming exacerbate sexual harassment? Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, ma'am. That was really insightful. So moving forward to the next question. Are marital rape, harassment also considered sexual harassment? And what can victim do, as most of the time they think it's a common as a perpetrator as her husband?
Yeah. So just to make a distinction, sexual harassment, which is what the law that we have, the UGC law act that we have, regulation, the Parliamentary Act of 2013 about sexual harassment of women in the workplace. These are harassment. They are not criminal offenses in that way, but sexual assault, marital rape. Now, our country does not have a marital rape law. In 2013, when the rape law was being amended, which included this sexual harassment of women in the workplace amendment, and it amended the two-finger test, for instance, it amended many things, including how women can be questioned in court. The marital rape law was also introduced, but it was refused. And it was not accepted. So India is a country that does not accept marital rape as a criminal act at all. But if we are to look at it, that is, you cannot send your husband to jail for raping you. Does that mean that marital rape doesn't happen? Not at all. So rape, sexual assault is different from sexual harassment. And I think this is an important distinction that we need to have in our minds as well. Sexual assault and sexual molestation are things that can be taken up by a criminal court as well. Sexual harassment is usually not taken up by a criminal court unless that stalking leads to endangering the safety of the woman or something like that. Now, what do you do about marital rape? There is no law against it. And when the law was refused, our minister at that time, who was a woman, she actually said that if we allow this law to come into place, then जो हमारी संस्कारी परिवार है, परिवार का संस्कार, that will be shattered. Our families will be destroyed if we allow this to become a law. And I remember thinking at that time that are we then saying openly that our families are based on the rape of the wife? Are we saying that if a woman is to say that I should have the right to say I don't want to have sex to my husband, that will destroy the family? What will that husband do? If the wife says I don't want to have sex, what is he going to do? How is he going to destroy the family? Is he going to say I'm going to divorce you? Is he going to say I'm going to leave you? And so what can a woman do? You know, there is no straightforward answer to that. At the basic level, having a discussion. But we know that the reason that patriarchy is so difficult to fight is because unlike, say, caste, where so-called lower caste can fight against so-called upper caste, unlike race, where Black Lives Matter, so you have white people and you have non-white people, unlike even class, where you have rich and poor people. In patriarchy, the people who we have to fight are our husbands, they're our brothers, they're our sons, they're our dearest friends. So how it takes the will to fight out, because you have to fight the people closest to you. And so we can't sit in the house with a placard saying, I'm not going to have sex. You can't do that, right? Whereas you can take a placard and say Black Lives Matter. So what is the solution to that? One of them is exactly what you all are doing, is sensitization and discussion and speaking. I think to myself that if there are so many young people even asking these questions, that as you go ahead in your lives and get married, perhaps you will not allow yourself to be raped by your husbands. And for the men who are here, perhaps you will ask your wives if they want to have sex or not, rather than raping them, because nobody wants to be a rapist. So one is this. But you know, there's a woman who writes about sexual harassment and assault called Catherine McClintock, and she's written this wonderful book called The Butterfly Effect, which has come out a few years ago. And one of the things that she says is very interesting, and I want you all to think about that, because we think about punishment all the time, but to think about the positive aspect. She says that having a law doesn't mean that a woman is going to take her husband and put him in jail. Having a law that protects her means that she can think, do I want to have sex? Is sex in my marriage a desirable thing for me to want? She can actually think about wanting to have sex in that marriage, a woman who knows that she's protected from rape. And so one of the things I want us to think about also in all these issues is not about punishing and pushing out, but is of looking at how these things can change the ways in which we think. Think of that young man who understands how toxic masculinity is destroying him. Think of that husband who feels he needs to force his wife to have sex all the time. Think of that husband trying to think in different ways of making himself attractive to his wife, or of finding his wife attractive to him. Look at what would happen to that relationship. Would that not be a wonderful relationship, rather than one in which you're forcing your wife to do all these things, to cook for you, to clean for you, you don't need to appreciate her? Look at how that starves that man of a relationship, of a real nurturing relationship. And you know, one of the things at the moment I'm teaching Mary Wollstonecraft, who is writing in the 1790s. She's written a tract called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she's writing at that time saying, women should be educated so that they become better companions for their husbands. So imagine in today's day, 300 years later, 250 years later, imagine if men recognized that women were equal to them. would it not really benefit men to have really good equal relationships with women in their lives, rather than having to suppress them and to be jail keepers all the time? So this question of marital rape, which is just very, very crucial, how do we change it? What can you do, especially if you're not economically independent? You cannot get up and leave. You cannot even speak to your husband because you have nowhere else to go. So how do we change these things slowly?
Thank you so much, ma'am, for enlightening our knowledge on this topic.
Moving ahead with the next question we have here is, what is the correct approach to help someone who has been physically or mentally harassed?
This is a question that's asked very often, because I think one of the things that we realize as we see so much harassment is, what can we do? And what not to do, I can tell you. I see this happening in my college all the time. Why did you touch my girlfriend? Why did you look at my girlfriend? And then the two men will break each other's heads. That's what not to do. So when a woman is being harassed, you don't go there and push her aside, because Hindi films teach us, Bollywood teaches us this, that the heroine is being attacked and the hero comes and beats the fellow up, and then the heroine falls in love with him. So that's what not to do, basically. These are strategies. Bystander strategies. They're called bystander strategies. And a lot of people have been talking about this thing. What does the bystander do when somebody is being assaulted or harassed mentally or physically? And what the strategies that have now come up from across the world, what they say is that the first thing to do is just to go and stand next to that person and say that you are not alone. I am here. I'm standing here next to you, even if that person is being harassed by someone. Because remember that the harassers are usually bullies, and they will catch somebody who's alone. Now, in many cases, you may be too scared to go and stand next to that person and to speak up against the person who is doing the harassment. So just to be able to call 2 or 3 people and to stand over there and give support to that person. But the really important thing is to ask that person, what do you want? How can I help you? Do you just want to come walk away with me and we can go and sit somewhere for a little while? And now you hear a lot of these stories that most of them come from the US or UK, that say if a woman wearing a hijab is being harassed by other people around her, a regular looking white woman will just go and sit next to her and start talking to her just about nothing. Which station are you getting down at? What is happening? Who is in your house? Just having a conversation to show that this is not an object of harassment. So if you find a woman in a metro is being harassed by other people, just to go and stand next to her and say, where do you live? What do you want to do? Where do you want to go? Just anything at all. Which college do you study in? What are you doing? But just to treat her like a human being, not an object. So one of the things that bystander strategy says is that ask them, what do you want me to do? Is there any way in which I can help you? I am here to support you. What happens when people are being mentally harassed? That is that you're not actually there at that time, but somebody shares with you that this is what is happening with me. One of the things that all of us try to do, and especially all of you, because this is the work you are doing and you are here to help other people, is to say, we must take action. This is what has happened to you. Let's go and complain. Let's go and talk to so-and-so. Let's make sure it never happens again. Again, that's the wrong thing to do. The first thing to do for anyone who is mentally harassed, who's been sexually harassed, is just to listen to them. Because one of the things that the harassed or traumatized person needs is someone who just gives them a chance to talk and a chance to cry. And when somebody is crying, especially if it is a boy, but even if it is a girl, is just to allow them to cry. Now, I have to tell you that I myself am very bad at this because I also start crying. And as I grow older, it happens more and more. Koi rona shuru karta hai, mere aansu nikalne shuru ho jate hain, and I just can't stop it. So that may not be very helpful to the other person. I try not to do that. But if you are crying with that person, there is no harm in it really, because you're also showing your empathy. You are showing that what is happening is not happening only to you. I understand, I feel your pain is also my pain. And so allowing them to speak, because usually when you allow someone to speak, they themselves will figure out what they want to do. So never ever force a mentally harassed or a sexually harassed person to take action right away. That you should never do. That should come only slowly and gently after they have spoken, after you have heard them out, after you have understood what they want. But the most important thing is to stand by them and help them in whatever they want you to do, is not to take over their action. It is to be able to help them with whatever they want. The second thing along with this, I'm going to say to people like you who are working on these issues, is also to train yourself for what avenues are open to you. So to be able to say, if you're in Aurobindo College, to say, look, there is Samvedana, there is Paki, there are people who are working on these issues, there are people who understand these issues. So very often what happens with me is that somebody will say, why don't you talk to Vinita Chandra? And they'll give them my phone number. So I often get phone calls saying, ma'am, can I talk to you? Is to put them in touch with someone who can talk to them. But all of you are also training yourselves on how to deal with these issues. So you should know that you can say to someone that you should know that there is a law that can protect you. Even if you don't want to go to the ICC, you should know that there is an ICC that takes up cases like yours. I have found in general that when somebody comes to tell me that they have been sexually harassed, I don't tell them to go and complain, but I just give them a copy of the UGC regulation or of Ordinance 15D. I used to carry one in my bag all the time, and I would always make sure I had a spare copy. I would say, just read this. So the person who reads that at least knows that these are the avenues open to them, and that they are not alone in what they are facing. With mental harassment, I have to say that it is something that because of this pandemic, a lot of students have reached out to us. There are students who are locked up in homes with abusive parents. There are students who are locked up in homes which are toxic. And I think one of the things that we should be careful of not doing is pop psychology. So the other thing that I have with myself all the time is a list of phone numbers of counselors, psychological counselors, and to say, just make one phone call and talk to this person at least once, because they're trained to tell you what to do. And none of us have that training to know what to do. But again, I'm just so impressed with the questions you all are asking. How do we help, rather than saying that we already know what to do?
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an instructive answer. We, as the member of these forums, would surely take a note of your words, so that next time we come across someone, we are someone who can actually help them out. Moving ahead, I have another question for you, ma'am. How does the differences in gender ratios affect the chances of discrimination in a given setup?
Gender ratio, you're talking about there being less women than men, isn't it? There are only 2 countries in the world that have a skewed gender ratio. I think that's India and China. And certainly neither of these countries have the greatest gender ratings. One of the things I want us to think about is that when across the world, women outlive men. We know this, that women outlive men. That is why the gender ratio across the world, there are more women than men. Not a lot more, but there are more women than men. What does it say about a country that has less women? I'm going to turn the question around, that where there is a skewed gender ratio, that is a society which already has a huge gender discrimination. So if girls are so unwanted that they are killed in the womb, or they are killed when they are born, female feticide, female infanticide, then that is a society that already discriminates against gender. And that is why the treatment of women in that society is going to be far worse than treatment in a society that welcomes girls, welcomes daughters. And I know that things are changing, and we see so many people saying that I wanted a daughter, I want a daughter, I'm very glad I have a daughter, and so on. But it's certainly not changing enough. And it's not changing enough because our mindset is not changing enough. One of the things I was very surprised, where I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was taken aback when I found out, is that education doesn't change things. Do you know that South Delhi, which has the highest number of educated or wealthier people, Their gender ratio is actually worse than other parts of Delhi. And one of the reasons it is worse is because they have money. They have money to bribe people to do ultrasounds, which is illegal in our country for many, many years now. They have the money to get those abortions, selective abortions done. And so education doesn't seem to be doing very much at the moment. Of course, we know that the only way to stop gender ratio and skewed gender ratio and gender discrimination is education. So for instance, in a state like Kerala, for instance, their gender ratio is also better than other states because their universal education, that is of men and women, those levels are also higher. But there's another part of this question that I want us to think about quickly. That is that you must have seen in some classrooms, like I teach English. So in an English classroom, you always have more women than men. And definitely, if you have more women sitting together and talking about issues, the women are going to be more vocal. And so gender discrimination or harassment is going to be less. I got a complaint from my physics or physical science, I've forgotten. I think it was a physics class. And that particular batch, which was for, I think, for lab or whatever it is, had only 6 girls, and it had many, many more men. And they said that even in general, women don't speak up very much because we are so few. But also look at the fact that physics or physical sciences is computer sciences are areas where fewer girls are going. And so there is already a gender discrimination because somehow women are made to feel that they're not good at physics, but they're good at English. So you have fewer girls there, and the people who are there then are also from a particular kind of mindset. So it is only when we have an equalization of gender ratio across different areas that we are going to have less harassment as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insights. I hope the attendee must have his or her question answered.
So moving ahead with the next question. In this patriarchal society, how is the discrimination against the dominating side perceived?
Against the dominating side. Just say that again. In patriarchal.
Yes, ma'am. In this patriarchal society, how is the discrimination against the dominating side perceived?
Against the dominating side. We're talking about discrimination.
Yes, ma'am.
So maybe are we looking at discrimination of men, perhaps? Is that what we are looking at?
Ma'am, against the male dominated.
Yes, ma'am.
That's what the question is. Yeah. Structurally and systemically, men are not discriminated against. So I'm not quite sure, but I guess what you do mean is, you know, that we have a society of men who are beaten by their wives, for instance, right? There is a society of men who are physically beaten by their wives, and they meet and they talk about this and so on. Now, I'm guessing that's what the question means, because in a patriarchal society, because the boy, the son, is so valorized. I mean, think about it. We always talk about the girl child. We don't ever talk about a boy child, because a child who's a boy is a child. A girl who's a child is a girl child. We need to sort of say, you know, we have had, this is a daughter, it's a girl. So because patriarchy in general is going to privilege men in their upbringing, in their being economically independent, in their being able to speak out. So there is a systemic and a structural privileging and entitlement of the dominant. That is why they're dominant. They're dominant because they're privileged, right? So, but I guess the question might be asking what happens to men who are discriminated against. And I am not sure about if discrimination is the right word, but I certainly can think about men who are physically assaulted by wives, for instance, because that's the one thing I know. I can't think that in a family that has sons and daughters, there would be discrimination against the son unless there is something else. That is, unless the son is disabled or has other mental issues or is gay, for instance. I can't think that the dominant would be discriminated against. But I do want to say that the just because we are talking about women's rights does not mean that men's rights are not important. That it is equally wrong for a man to be beaten up by his wife as it is for a woman to be beaten up by her husband. It is equally wrong. And there is no justifying that at all. It is just not good enough to say that, oh, only 1% of men are beaten up, whereas 99% are women. That's not good enough. Because that 1% is actual human beings. They're not just a percentage. So it is equally bad. And the fact that it happens is something that should be addressed as well. It can't be addressed through patriarchy because it's not a patriarchal problem. Women being beaten is a patriarchal problem. Marital rape is a patriarchal problem. Domestic abuse is a patriarchal problem. It comes from men being more powerful than women. Women beating up their husbands is a different kind of problem. And I think it has to be looked at in a different kind of way. It has to be, I think psychological counseling for those men is very important. I think psychological counseling for those women is very important. And I think it's crucial to see how to resolve those problems as well. I'm not sure if I've answered that question very well because I didn't understand the question very well, but hopefully that explains something of what was asked.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I hope that any may got his or her answer. So one note for everyone that attendees are requested to fill the feedback form to be eligible for the certificates.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing. Next up, I have a question which says, does prostitution violate women's human rights in specific?
Prostitution is such a huge question and it's a very complex question. It's not a simple question. There is the feminist position which says that if men are going to make money out of women's bodies, that is not just by prostitution, but by making women's bodies pose next to a car or a washing machine. If men are going to use, if in a patriarchy, men use women's bodies to make money, why should women not use their own bodies to make money? And there is a way, and I'm just going to say this, I know it's a very complex question, which is to say that why should women's bodies be seen different from their brains? That is that why should sex work be any different from any physical labor? If you are paid for, if you pay a woman for hauling bricks on her head, how is that any different? And the reason this question is raised is to say that this whole idea of chastity, that a woman should have chastity, that a woman's soul resides, in a sense within her sexuality, within her vagina, that this itself is a patriarchal construct. And there is this position that says that a woman who is raped would not see herself any differently from if her arm or leg was broken, if there was not this whole thing about women's chastity, right? Now, we can say this, and intellectually I can understand this, but emotionally, I can't understand this position at all. All of us know that being raped is not the same as having your arm and leg broken. So even as I am saying this to you, I know that it's not possible for us to feel this way. Maybe society will have to change completely, so completely that sex is seen as just another activity, like eating or drinking. It's not seen as any differently. Maybe that time will come, I don't know. Then maybe these things will make sense. So to look at prostitution, is prostitution in itself a violation of women's rights? I'm not so sure, because if a woman decides she wants to make money out of her own body, I think it may be more important to regulate prostitution, to make sure that prostitutes, like all other workers, get health insurance, that they have police protection, that they are not exploited, that there's no violence against prostitutes and so on. That's one part of what I want to say. But the other thing that I do want to say is that, that they say that prostitution is the oldest profession, right? It's been there always. We can't think of a time when there has been no prostitution. And one of the things I want us to think of is just the entitlement that men have for sexual gratification. That men must be sexually gratified on a woman's body, whether they have to pay that woman or they have to rape that woman. So why is male sexual gratification such a non-controvertible thing? That is to say that just because you need to have sex doesn't mean that it has to be on a woman's body. Take a cold shower maybe. Why is it that prostitution is seen as such a necessary institution? After all, it is not as if women don't have sexual desires. Why is women's sexual gratification never even talked about, never even considered? Why do we not say that we need to have institutions, services that give women sexual gratification, because what are women going to do? So prostitution itself as an institution is problematic, because justifying it means saying that you have to have women there that men can pay if they need sexual gratification. And that's one of the important issues that I want us to think about as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Putting forth the next question that we have here is, how are the nonsensical judgments from certain high courts across India against women's rights contributing to the crime against certain genders?
I think a lot. I think so much. And I'm so glad you have asked this question. It's just such a good question. See, we have such a respect for our courts. We live in a parliamentary democracy, and there are three arms to a parliamentary democracy, as we know: the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative. And we have an inordinate respect for our judges. And our society has created judges who are above all else. We call them Your Highness, Your Honor. I think we call them Your Honor. We say the Honorable Court and so on and so forth. They wear those robes and all that. So their judgment is supposed to be much higher than yours and mine judgment. And their judgment is meant to take into account all the rights that people have, all the legislation that there is, the fundamental rights guaranteed to us in the Constitution. So for instance, one of the cases that recently a judge has talked about is this one from the Bombay High Court, where it said that where a man groped a 9-year-old girl's breast, but over her clothes, even as he was trying to take her salwar off, and he was caught at that moment. And the judgment said that if there is no skin-to-skin contact, it won't come under POSCO. Now, look, this is the kind of judgment that I'm sure the questioner is asking. Look at how ridiculous this judgment is. What does it mean? It means that someone who reads the judgment says, the next time I want to assault someone, I can use this loophole to say that if it is over the clothes, it is not going to be considered. I'm not going to get punished by it. That's one part of what it does. But the other thing that it does is that it also comes into our popular culture. So if you look at the Tarun Tejpal case, where the woman was victim blamed for everything that happened to her, even though the CCTV cameras were there, and Tarun Tejpal himself apologized and accepted what he had done wrong. Even then, they have managed to turn the entire case around on the victim. If you look at that case, which happened several years ago, in which this woman scholar had come from America, I think, and she complained against one of the Dastan Goi people. And the court said that she's a stellar witness. We know that she's telling the truth. We don't deny that she said no, that she doesn't want to have sex. But the judgment said that sometimes a feeble no is equal to a yes. That's what the judgment said. And he was acquitted on that basis. Now, all Bollywood tells us this. The old song, Nana karke pyar tumhi se kar baithe. So Nana kara, if you're a good heroine, you're not going to right away say, oh my God, you're so handsome, I love you. That's not going to happen. That's the vamp. That's not the heroine. The heroine has to first say, no, I'm not interested in you. And so what popular culture is teaching us is what the judges are supporting. And that reinforces this popular culture, this public perception, this common sense that this is the way girls are going to behave. So we need to be able to, that we have the right to do things that they don't want. And I think this is why court judgments are so much more damaging than anything that you or I can say. I can get up and say, oh, I think that if a man has not touched skin to skin, then that's not sexual assault. I can say that and you can question me, but we don't question the courts that much. So the really good thing, which is very heartening for us to remember, is that the state of Goa has taken up against the Tarun Tejpal case that I think it's the Supreme Court that has asked for this High Court, Bombay High Court judgment to be reconsidered. I saw this in the paper a few days ago, that's why I remember, but these judgments are being looked at again.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your critical insights. Thank you so much.
So, ma'am, we have next question for you from one of our attendees. What if the harassment is not sexual in nature, but is still directed at me because I am a woman?
Yeah. Under the UGC regulation, that comes under sexual harassment. Because it says that if you create an intimidating or hostile work environment or an intimidating or hostile learning environment on the basis of someone's gender, then that is a sexual harassment. Now, this is a very, very good question, and this is crucial. And I really want for you all to listen to this part of what I have to say. So often we say that we are not treating someone like this because they're a woman, that we would have treated them the same way if they were a man. And this case that has happened in my own college recently, where the council members of one of the societies was harassed by two men. There was no sexual favors asked, there was no sexual undertone at all. They were just constantly told that they were inefficient, that they were not working properly, they were not doing things properly, they didn't know how to be office bearers, that they really shouldn't stand for elections next time because they were not good enough. And the two men kept telling us again and again that they are so bad in their work that we would have said the same thing if they were boys also. There's two things about this I want us to remember. The first one is that in any place where men and women are there together, we always have much higher expectations of women. And I know that all my women colleagues know this, that women have to work much harder to prove themselves than men have to. Women have to show that they can work, that they can, in spite of having a home and children, in spite of being just a woman, that their administrative acumen is as good as that of men's, that they can do planning, they can do finances. Women always have to prove themselves. And women live in a structure where men are considered to be better for all jobs than women are. So when we say that we are not treating them like this because they are women, we would have behaved the same way if they were men, this is the textbook response of people who do not understand patriarchy at all. So when the boy said to me that we did not treat them like women, we treated them just like office bearers, for me, this shows a complete blindness to any issue of patriarchy at all. If these men had even said that, yes, we know that as women, it could be taken that they are women, but here are the factual things. These are the things that they did, and these are the things that could have been done in different ways, that would have been a different matter. But to say that they are just inefficient, they just don't know how to work, that is stereotypical textbook cases, I say, of the way that patriarchy functions. So that is one part, just to see that women are always held up to a higher standard. But there's another part of this that I want to talk to you all about, which I think is very important for all of us. And this is something that only because I have been talking to so many women and doing active research that even I have realized this, which is that even supposing that exactly the same thing was said to a man, why does a woman take it in a very different way from what a man would take it? Why are women harassed so much more easily than men? And one of the reasons that aggression, if men are aggressively saying you're bad at this, you haven't done this properly, and you say, well, if you were a man, you would have been able to take it, but just because you're a woman, you can't take it. Yes, we can't take it because we are women. And why can we not take it because we are women? Because every single day of our lives, we experience this. We experience the reality of being women every single day of our lives. We know that if our parents are sending us for an education and are spending money on our education, we have to justify that. We know that unlike boys, we can't say all girls should be educated. We know that if our parents allow us to work, it is that they are allowing us to work. We recognize that we are being allowed, we are being given permission. How many women will say, my husband is really nice, he allows me to work. My husband allows me to keep my own money. This is how we talk. This is how all of us talk all the time. So the fact is that every single day of our lives, we experience our lives as women. If our sons and husbands help around the house, we don't say that they are doing their own housework. We say they're doing our housework. So whether it is in our day-to-day lives, or whether it is our physical safety, always our physical safety. When we are out on the road, when we're even within the house. Now look at the question that one of you asked. How do you stand up to a husband who's raping you? What do you do because you're living in the house with them? How do you stand up to a brother who's shouting at you and shouting loudly at you and aggressively at you? What do you do about those things? So yes, women do react to aggression differently from men do. And that is because women do live in fear almost all the time, even though we don't recognize it or say it to ourselves. We naturalize it. We just say, oh, because I'm a woman, I got more scared when I got shouted at. But there is a reason that women get scared more. So the two parts to this that I want us all to think about. One is that it is almost impossible for men or women to treat each other equally. It is almost impossible. And the other part is that, yes, women get harassed more easily. And yes, women have to be treated differently from men. And that is because we live in a patriarchy that is so aggressive to women all the time. But that's an absolutely wonderful question. And I want this to be a life lesson for all you young women who are going out in the workplace. I want you to remember this, that you don't have to think of yourself as weaker because you got harassed. You have to think of yourself as being an aware and alert woman who recognized harassment when she saw it and who chose to speak up against that harassment. That's one of the things you must remember.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your valuable insights. That was really thought-provoking.
Ma'am, we have a couple of more questions. If you allow, we would like to take those up, or I would straight away move to the last question for our today's session.
Please go through all the questions. I would hate to leave a question unanswered. You all are asking such questions.
Sure, ma'am. So the question I have now is, it says, how is feminism as a concept different from that of pseudo-feminism? And the next part of the question is, how has the concept of pseudo-feminism developed in our society?
Yeah. I know the definition of feminism. All of us know it, that men and women should have equal opportunities. I don't really have a definition of pseudo-feminism because there is nothing like the thing in itself doesn't exist. But I do know what you're talking about. And it's not a new thing. Many years ago, when I taught in Rutgers University and I was teaching feminism, as you can imagine, many of the white men in my class did not take very well to being taught feminism by a brown woman. And I was told also that, oh, you people need feminism in India because you are still burning all your brides. But we people, I was told, we people pay 80 cents to the man's dollar, so we are equal. 80 cents to the man's dollar is considered equal. It's impossible to conceive that you should be paid $1 for $1, right? But I was told that there's this new concept called KATM feminism, which is kill all the men feminism. And so somehow, this whole idea that feminism means that women want to be more equal than men is the general misconception. Right now, first of all, as you all know, equality is equality. You cannot have more equal and less equal. You can only be unequal. I think that if you look at statistics in the world around you, statistics will show you that women are so far away from being equal in any sphere. You know that women own about 20% of the property in the world as compared to men. This is women across the world. That women do much more work across the world, many more hours of labor, and get paid less than 1/3 that men do. You know that there is no country in the world that gives equal pay for equal work to men and women. Iceland has passed a law. It's the first country to pass a law saying that there should be no wage gap. And even that, they are saying that they are going to try to do it by 2023. So even to say that the wage gap should be wiped out is not there at all. Violence against women is so much more than violence against men across the world. So what are women trying to do, or what are men and women trying to do? Because, you know, we have a wonderful Manas over here who is part of this whole thing. So I'm not going to say only women. You know, what are men and women trying to do? What are feminist men and women trying to do? They're only trying to move towards equality. And we are so far from equality that it's not going to happen in any of our lifetimes, not even in your children's lifetimes or your grandchildren's lifetime. It's not going to happen. How can we have pseudo-feminism? Supposing that maybe 100 years from now, men and women are almost equal. That is, women are being paid 99 cents to the man's dollar, let's say. And then at that time, women start saying, I don't know, something else. Maybe then we can think about pseudo-feminism. But at the moment, how can we have pseudo-feminism when we don't have equality? Because if feminism says men and women should be equal, then what does pseudo-feminism say? Even if pseudo-feminism says women should be more equal than to men, that's not a reality at all. There's no way that can ever happen. So it's one of the things for us to think about. And the reason I talked about this actually in the beginning is because almost every talk I go to, I get this. You know, the two men who were accusing the council members, who were all women, kept saying that you're fake feminists. They kept calling them fake feminists. And they were calling them fake feminists because they were saying we are being harassed. So what is fake feminism? How can a woman be a fake feminist? Because a woman, by her position, is so unequal in every way. And, you know, I'm going to say this, I'm a very outspoken woman in my own college. And I know that I'm seen as someone who's very outspoken. Even then, if there's a staff council happening and I'm looking at all my colleagues over here and we're all yelling at each other, I can't even think of getting up and shouting like those men shout. I can't even think about it. Even when I get up and speak, I always say, I just have a suggestion to make, if it's okay with you, or do you mind if this is how I speak. And even as I'm speaking like that, I keep kicking myself. I'm cringing at myself that I teach these things. Why am I talking like this? And yet it is so deeply ingrained in all of us. So even when I say men and women should be equal, I'm always trying to sound a bit appeasing, like, don't take me wrongly, you know, or something. Please don't be upset by what I'm saying, is the way that I talk most of the time. So supposing that I am saying that women should be more equal than men, is it ever going to become a reality? Until we reach that level where we're even close to equality, only then can you think of having pseudo-feminism or fake feminism. Until then, there is only feminism. There is nothing else. But there is also the fear of feminism. There's the fear of women saying we want equality. And I think this is why I keep saying one of the things for us to understand is it's not as if this is a pie that all of us, that if somebody takes more, somebody will get less. Not at all. That's not the way it is at all. There is enough space for equality for all of us. And equality is going to make the world a better place. John Stuart Mill writes about this in the 19th century. He says, just imagine, because at that time women were not allowed to work. He says, just imagine 50% of our population is not allowed to apply for jobs of doctors and lawyers and teachers. And he says that means, first of all, that 50% of the best people out of those 50%, we cannot have treating us when we go to hospitals. And because you are saving these jobs only for 50% of the people, even the worst out of them is getting those jobs. So how is this making us a better society? And so one of the things to think about is that if women become equal, it's going to benefit everyone in society. But until that time, there really is no pseudo-feminism.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your critical insights. Thank you.
I must say, ma'am, you are truly an inspiration to all of us. So moving forward with the next question, what exactly is the ICC supposed to do once a case of sexual harassment has been proven?
So, you know, the ICC is, the document is there. I'm sure that, your faculty members will also share that document with you. It has a very well laid out procedure. And that procedure tells you exactly how to complain, how the complaint is to be taken up, how you serve a charge sheet, and for what kind of misdemeanor, what kind of punishment you give. So if it is for students with students, if it is a student against teacher, teacher against student, it's very well documented. And it does tell you that if it is a first time offense, then you can give a warning letter, you can ask for an apology. It looks at the gravity of the offense. So the document is there. And, I would urge, Dr. Shobna and Dr. Rashmi to share the document with your students, because I think it's very important for everyone to be very familiar with that document, so that you know exactly what constitutes sexual harassment, you know exactly what you can do if it is there, and you know your rights. And I think it's very important for that document to be shared with all faculty members also. I had recently organized a gender sensitization session for the faculty, in which we had called a Supreme Court advocate who is a member of our ICC. And she actually was able to speak to the faculty and tell them that here are the laws. So for instance, in my staff room, I have seen oftentimes a girl will come in for something and a male teacher will put his hand on her head. And he will just say, well, I'm only giving her blessing. Simple things, I would say. Just don't touch girl students. Just don't touch them. Because you don't know if even you're putting your head on their hand on their head is okay or not. Don't touch their shoulder. Don't touch them. Simple things like this. But I think it's very important for people to understand. You cannot, we had a case a few years ago where a man was taking this girl for an internship, a teacher. And as he introduced her to people in the office, he put his arm around her shoulder and she said she was very uncomfortable. And when she complained, he said that I only had good intentions. Remember that the UGC regulation says that your intentions don't make any difference at all. The only way to say whether it is sexual harassment or not is if it makes the person who is complaining uncomfortable, if it is unwelcome. So I really would suggest share the document and read through it carefully, all of you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I hope that any must got his or her answer.
Ma'am, so we have like the last couple of questions with us. It is more or less similar. I would like to read it out for you. The question says, what is a girl supposed to do if she wants to raise her voice against any sexual harassment, but her family does not support her by saying, what will the society say about it? And the next part is, sometimes the girl is being sexually harassed by a family member. In this situation, she can't prove her innocence. So how should a girl go through this situation?
Yeah, they're both very relevant questions, because when girls come to me in college and they have been sexually harassed and I ask them to complain, almost always they say that their families won't allow it to happen. And the family is a very strong force. I know that. There's two things with that. One is that either you can go against the family and you can complain. But supposing you can't do that, I think the next best thing would be to be able to talk to other people about it, to find a group of people to talk about it. And, I see so many of your faculty members here. I would say, even if it is 2 or 3 women who are able to talk about it, to approach one of your faculty members. Now, I'm not saying that we can take the place of your parents, not at all. And I really believe that the difference between a teacher and a parent should be very clear to everyone. We are not here to give unconditional nurturing. We are teachers, we are professors, we have a job. But part of our job is also education, not just teaching English or computer science or history, but education. And I think that if you know that there is an empathetic faculty member, I think just going and speaking about it is important. Now, you may say that if that person is not punished, then what good is it? So remember that I had spoken about this last time also, that one of the things sexual harassment does is it takes the power away from you. It takes the control away from you. It makes you feel powerless. But when you are able to talk about it, it gives you back some of your agency. It gives you the control over your own narrative, to be able to say, this is what happened to me, this is how I felt, and this is why it was wrong. And you will find in most cases, I have found in a lot of cases where girls talk to each other or to other friends, approach a faculty member and talk, they are able to pick up the courage to discuss this with their parents also, and then take up the case also. But even if that doesn't happen, I think one of the things, and I'm going to suggest this to your faculty here also, is that if a student is too scared or doesn't want to go through that whole inquiry process, I think one of the really good things to do is to call both sides, because you are faculty members in this college and you have the right to tell a student that you can take disciplinary action against them, that, or even otherwise, students usually listen to faculty, but to call the girl and the boy and to make them sit in front of you and allow that girl to speak to the boy and say, this is what you have done to me. I think that is very important, because at least you feel that you have been able to tell this person that this is what you have done to me, and a faculty member will be able to create a safe space so that you're not scared of the aggression of that boy. And the faculty member will also be able to counsel the girl and to explain to the boy what he has done is wrong, so that hopefully he doesn't repeat it in future. So I know that a majority of cases do not make it to the ICC. And one of the reasons is because girls are scared of what their parents will say. And this whole thing, ki hamari badnami ho jayegi, also then influences the girl. She also feels that if she talks, then it will be the honor of her family will go. And that is why, that is the way, as I said, patriarchy works. It works by silencing women. That the khandan ki izzat depends on that girl, not on the boy who has done the molestation, but on the girl who has been molested. You will never hear a family saying ki tumne ladki ko chua to hamari khandan ki naak kat gayi. Never. That never happens in most families. But it depends on the girl. You know, the more tricky question is the second one that you have asked, that when it is a family member, what do you do? And I really wish I had an answer to that question, and I don't, because I see it happening all the time. Just all the time. What do you do? Who do you speak to when it is your mother's brother or your father's brother? Who do you speak to? Who do you go to? Are your parents willing to disrupt that family because of this thing that has happened? What do you do if it is your chacha's son or your mama's son or your masi's son? What do you do with that? Now, in most cases, I know that there's not very much you can do. And one of the things that I would suggest is just going for counseling, because depending on the gravity of that sexual assault or molestation, the trauma is not likely to leave. So I think trying to find counseling from a trained person is very important. The other thing that I have seen in all the sessions I do in college is that even after that person comes and speaks to me and says, I was sexually assaulted in my family, once the words are out, somehow that lid that is there, that silence has kept it under pressure in you for so many years, and that lid is raised. And I find that then this student can also talk to other friends in the college, to like-minded people. And just talking about it helps. I have to tell you that the greatest success story I have happened just now in the last month. In one of the classes after I did the sensitization, 3 girls wanted to stay back and talk to me. And each of them had been sexually molested when they were children. One was by her masi's son, one was by the neighbor's son, and one was by a tutor. And so I spoke to them and I said, first of all, you're 18 years old, tell your mothers, please tell your mothers, please tell your mothers. You have to tell an adult in your family. And I met them 3 weeks later and I said, what happened? And so the first girl said that after she spoke to me, she sent a message to her masi's son. She didn't tell her mother, she didn't tell anyone else. She says, tumko yaad hai, tum mere ghar aaye the, wo shaadi mein aur tumne mere saath kya kara tha? She sent this message to him. And this happened, she said, about, now she's 18, this happened, I think about 10 or 12 years ago, she says. And as soon as she sent the message, he rang her up. And she says she just broke out in a cold sweat and she didn't answer the phone. She was too scared. Then she called one of the other 3 girls who were there together. And the 2 of them did a conference call to him. And when he picked up the phone, he was so scared, he started stammering and stuttering and saying, oh, I'm in the marketplace, I can't talk to you just now, I'm going to call you later on. And he never called her back. And she said that his sister was getting married. There was a big wedding in the house. This is Amasi's son after all. And she said, at least now I know that I am not going to be scared looking at him. He's going to be scared looking at me. And she said, most likely I'm not going to tell anyone about what he has done to me because there's a wedding. I don't want things to become like this, at a happy time. But she said, at least now I have the power that I can expose him anytime and he's scared of that. And the other girl whose tutor had done this and has now moved away, she said that she tried very hard to tell her mother. And one day she even called me and she said, ma'am, you told me to talk to my mother. I just can't do it. I said, koi baat nahi, dheere dheere ho jayega. By the time I spoke to her 3 weeks later, she said that slowly she started talking to her mother about women's rights, about feminism, about what they were doing in college and all that. And she said one day, just by chance, something came up and she told her mother. And she says that her mother told her that I always thought that something is happening to you at that time. You never spoke to me, but as a mother, I had a feeling that something is happening to you. And now I know that this is what I was scared of. Why didn't you tell me earlier? And she says her mother told her, then talked to her and said that, do you know that even your Nani went through something like this? But basically she and her mother were now part of a larger group of people to whom this had happened, and they could talk to each other about it. And she says that sometimes the mother gets a little upset by my feminist ideas, all of which she has learned after coming to college. But she says both of us are talking to each other about it now. So this, I just felt, because there's so many of these where I never meet that student again, they never tell anyone again. But the stories where it makes a difference, and you can speak to someone. I think just that itself is a very important thing. So, but that's one of the most heartbreaking things to hear. And in all the work that I do, sessions like this, which just is, for me, is just a very crucial work in my life, I believe, apart from teaching English literature. This is the one that gives me the most emotional trauma, because what do you do when you hear about small children who are so defenseless and they're being assaulted by someone who's in their family, who's right there, who's trusted by everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. With this, we have covered the last question for our today's interactive session. We have tried to cover as many questions as possible. I'm sure all our attendees must have received the responses they sought for. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time and patiently addressing all our queries. Your critical insights and instructive comments have created a huge impact on all our minds. We leave this webinar with minds filled with compassionate ideologies, and we believe to take an informed step next time we witness any incidents of gender harassment or gender discrimination. With this, I would like to hand over the dais to our anchors for the day, Manas and Shreya. Thank you so much.
To be true, I'm out of words, ma'am. No words can make up for the humane precept you have shared with us. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your words of veracity. We are truly inspired, and this will remain with us till our breath lasts.
The roots of all goodness lies in this.
Thank you so much, Vineeta. Pleasure to have you as always.
The roots of all goodness lies.
I think some mic problem happened.
Thank you so very much. We almost took 2 hours of your precious time.
As it is a pleasure to be here. And, I think both you and Shobna are doing just such important work in bringing these students together and, creating this space for them to be able to do this kind of work. I think it's just absolutely wonderful. I know that everyone has so many other things going on in their own lives, and to organize this and to do it and to have trained your students so well to carry on something. I'm taking inspiration from you all, and I'm going to try to do a similar kind of thing with my students so that they also learn how to, do webinars like this. But I just really believe what the work that Shobna and you and I and others are doing. We have to change the world, and how are we going to change the world without these young people? I truly believe that they are going to change the world.
We have a fabulous team. there are other faculty members along with us. There's Dr. Vandana Bhalla, there's Dr. Anita, and Dr. Rinki. So all of us, together want to inspire our kids to take it further.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much. Your talk has been very, very moving.
Yes.
Thank you all for calling me.
We shall do that again.
Yeah.
I hope so. I hope we can, and maybe we can have our students meet together once. That would be very nice. So we'll try and organize that.
Let's hope we are post-pandemic soon enough.
I know that we can physically meet. That would be wonderful. That would be very nice. Thank you all for calling me, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.